On September 2nd, 1945, the Great Patriotic War ended, yet the effects from the World War had just begun. Although the war was over, countries, economies, and societies were continually declining. The events of the war caused many problems in Western European countries such as Czechoslovakia, which ultimately led to more violence and protests. It all started when countries began accepting communism into their society as gratitude for the Soviet Union, freeing them from Germany's rule. Czechoslovakia, in particular, was thankful for their newfound freedom as they were finally liberated from the harsh laws of Hitler. However, this transition in government was also due to the potential of another attack from the strong world power. Countries were already weak from previous invasions, so this convinced many countries to adopt communism. Additionally, it provided an opportunity to build up the country's weak economy that had declined in the war. All of this was known as the Iron Curtain, a form of extreme demarcation between the Soviet Union and non-communist countries throughout Europe. It stood as a symbol of brokenness from 1945 until it was destroyed after the Cold War of 1991. Before World War II, Czechoslovakia had been a strong democracy in Europe. Although it had its ups and downs, the real fall of the democracy happened through the war. The Soviet Union had invaded many European countries, including Czechoslovakia. Once captured, many countries acted as the Soviets as puppets. After evolving under Russian dominance, most European countries became communist. They felt obligated to meet Russia's demands and wanted to keep positive trading relations. The Communist Party also had a tight policy and control on the citizens. If anyone spoke out about the unjust supremacy of the current government style, they would be a political insurgent and outcast, thrown into prison. Europe suffered deeply through the war. A great deal of its economy had collapsed, transportation infrastructures laid in ruins, and agricultural production had subsided significantly, resulting in most of the continent to be on the brink of absolute hunger. One of the only powers in the world that had not been damaged as notably was the United States. Due to this, Secretary of State George C. Marshall initiated a program for post-war economic improvement. On June 5, 1947, at Harvard University, Marshall announced the Marshall Plan publicly. The U.S. gave over $13 billion to European countries, so Europe would adopt democratic principles and gain economic assistance after the detrimental World War II. Czechoslovakia wanted to accept a portion of this money to build their economy back up post-war, which would help them to revert back to a democracy. But despite these efforts, Czechoslovakia was forced to deny the Marshall Aid by Joseph Stalin, who wanted to resist American diplomacy. A Soviet coup stopped any ideas about financial aid and democracy by throwing democratic politicians into jail. The Czechoslovakian president of that time, Edvard Beneš, was ousted and replaced by a communist to make sure that this idea would not rise again. Because of all this, Czechoslovakia suffered, while the countries around it began to recover. During the 1960s, there were many changes in leadership that led to the softening of communist rules and doctrines. In 1968, the head of the Communist Party was ousted and replaced by Alexander Dubček. With a new government leader, citizens were granted more freedoms. The Czechoslovakian government attempted liberalization to free the press and the news that was censored because of Soviet Union regulations again. They tried to design socialist reforms, a better and freer style of government. Dubček saw the effects of communism and realized how detrimental it was to Czechoslovakia's economy, leading him to favor socialism as well. On January 5, 1968, Dubček used his everlasting charisma and influence to lead a group of protesters, mostly students, into demonstrations in the streets. These uprisings were known as the Prague Springs.
I remember when I heard the speeches, it was a very powerful feeling because I never heard people speaking so freely in front of thousands of people, and I could see how people were reacting, and this was totally unusual. I just remember this power of the crowd. Of course, the power of the crowd can be very dangerous, right?
Concerned over the new reforms and protests, the Soviet Union caught Czechoslovakia by surprise and invaded. 2,000 tanks and 20,000 soldiers rolled into the country with the goal of crushing reformist trends in Prague. Many things were destroyed, such as buildings, cars, and homes, leaving Czechoslovakia a tragic mess. The attack was swift and successful for the Soviets. However, Jan Palach, a Czech student, had killed himself as a martyr in hopes to encourage more protests. Except that soon after, the Soviets kicked Dubček out of power and established a new government that reinforced the communist doctrines. That ended the idea of Prague Springs, making it a failed attempt at ending communism. Although Prague Springs was unsuccessful, the anti-communist movement caught more and more attention of rock bands, such as the Plastic People of the Universe. They began producing songs of encouragement for protesters across Czechoslovakia. The Plastics toured the country, spreading the message to anyone who would listen. members were arrested in December 1976 due to the disruption of peace caused in the country and government. To protect the arrest of the plastic people of the universe, Václav Havel, along with 241 individuals, circulated and signed a petition called the Manifesto of Charter 77. The charter was considered a coalition of 235 Czechs and 6 Slovaks, which consisted of writers, artists, and intellectuals who wanted to defy the silencing of their precious music. As a step towards inducting socialism, these activists signed the charter in the beginning of 1977 because they knew it was their right. By the end of the 1980s, the Soviet Union started falling apart economically, which let Czechoslovakia start its revolution once again, without fear of the Soviets stopping it. The first protests of the communist resistance began in January 1989, which was near the 20-year mark of the death of Jan Polak. People gathered but were brutally dispersed by the police. The demonstrations continued throughout the year, but the next major one was on October 28th, the anniversary of the founding of Czechoslovakia. The demonstrators gathered once again in Wenceslas Square in Prague, where they held up V's for victory as they demanded freedom and democracy.
The focus is on Czechoslovakia. Now hundreds of thousands of Czechoslovaks are in the streets.
The turning point for the revolution was on November 17, 1989, which was the biggest protest in the last 20 years. Thousands of student protesters marched through the city peacefully until the police had no choice but to stop the riot with violence. Because of this, Václav Havel called for an emergency meeting, which resulted in the creation of the Civic Forum led by Havel himself. They tried to find a way to voice their opinions with the least violence possible. People continued to protest on the 19th and on the 21st. More than 200,000 people stood out on the streets for the 5th consecutive day of protest. The number grew to 300,000, to 500,000 people, to 750,000 demonstrators, around 75% of Czechoslovakia's total population. Havel addressed these crowds, giving them hope for a change. His motivation convinced many people to protest, but more specifically, his presidency. On the 25th and 26th, all of these people attended a 2-hour general strike that ultimately led to the resignation of the communist leader, Gustav Husak. The day after, the Czechoslovakian communist government renounced its power and allowed all single-party state governments to collapse. Finally, the 29th of December marked the day where Václav Havel became the president of the new democratic Czechoslovakia.
Takovou velikou manifestaci na Letné, kde bylo asi 3/4 milionu lidí a ten den byla svatořečena nebo svatá Anežka, česká svatá tedy. A tehdy jsem já osobně měl pocit, že už jsme překročili ten Rubikon a že nebude protiútok. Tam ještě takoví ti jestřábové v armádě stále ještě uvažovali.
Czechoslovakia was free of communism, yet disagreements still ensued. In June 1990, protest leader Havel was elected president of the newfound Czech Republic again. After these astonishing votes and results, it became obvious that there were two distinct separations in political ideals. Slovaks were immersed in nationalist demands and were set on developing an independent territory of their own. In the same sense, Czechs advocated the Social Democratic Party, a new way of dividing authority. While Slovaks were open to a democratic government, they settled on a reformed communist party, making the split of Czechoslovakia the evident solution. On December 31st, the Federal Parliament and Civic Forum voted to dissolve the country. So the following day, June 1st, 1993, Czechoslovakia officially split into two different countries, the Czech Republic and Slovakia. This was known as the Velvet Divorce, which shocked people all over the world. Havel once said, "It's not as famous as some other anniversaries linked to the fall of communism, but I believe this relative oblivion and obscurity is what makes it so significant." The Velvet Revolution still continues to influence and inspire Czechs and Slovaks to speak out. This year, 2018, marks the 25th anniversary of the Velvet Divorce. In 1989, students were carrying Czechoslovakian flags. Now they are carrying Czech Republic flags high and mighty, and they are more united than ever.